European society put agriculture at the top of the scale of evolutionary development, so First Nations to the Europeans looked uncivilized. Because of this, the government and missionaries tried to make them farmers as part of their civilization process. However, even if First Nations people wanted to take more part in agriculture, the Europeans left them little farmable land. When First Nations peoples were in agriculture economy, there were discriminatory laws in favor of the settlers. That is part of the reason the agricultural interest drove the interior people away. There were many differences between First Nations agriculture and the Europeans. First Nations used a large mass of land and utilized plants and animals that were in the area, while Europeans cleared land to grow a few specific crops like wheat or even an amount of area with just livestock. With the limitations placed upon the First Nations with unoccupied land, it was harder to become a farmer because land and water was next to impossible to obtain for First Nations people. Europeans had different rules. Any homesteader that could come could have up to 320 acres if they improved it through making it farmable. Through 1860 to 1870s, many settlers arrived and took prohibited land, like the First Nations burial grounds and village sites. The First Nations tried to seek justice, but then they realized that the system was against them. The First Nations, after the smallpox epidemic, had hoped to be getting back on their feet, only to realize that the land and animals were disappearing because of expanding farmland. When the Fraser River salmon run failed in 1879, Chief William printed a letter stating that his men were going to starve because the Europeans had taken their land and animals. His men were angry and they planned not to leave peacefully. He said, "I am an Indian chief and my people are threatened by starvation. The white men have taken all the land and fish. The country was ours and it is all gone. My people will not starve in peace." First Nations were involved in agriculture in three ways: subsistence farming, which was the most common of the three, which was to provide food for the family. Commercial farming hit its stride from 1890 to 1920. First Nations had a hard time with commercial farming, while other small farmers were having trouble because of World War I. First Nations were facing difficulties because they weren't allowed to expand. First Nations farmers could not get irrigation because they weren't allowed to hold a water license. Then the realization came that they could be instead working on a farm as laborers. This was the third way First Nations got involved in agriculture. Working as laborers for big farms better suited First Nations lifestyle because they could work with the seasons and continue participating in seasonal activities. The hop industry hired a large amount of First Nations for the seasonal work. The berries of the hop plant were used to make beer. Women and children picked the berries, while men took care of the plant's sacks and operated the kilns. A picker could earn 1 cent a pound, making as much as $3 a day. Hop picking was more than a job to the people. It was a social gathering that brought together different tribes and helped them trade food and other things they made. They also held competitions and caught up on the news. First Nations were relied on for the large hop plantations from 1870 to 1940. When mechanics replaced them, cattle ranching came into the interior. And with the skills needed to work with the ranch, First Nations realized it suited their lifestyle. They had skills of riding and breeding horses, so they just applied that to the cattle. Few First Nations were able to successfully run a ranch. Napoleon Thomas was one of these few. Although he signed Treaty 8 and had to give up his Indian status and rights to preempt land for ranching. Napoleon Thomas, after giving up his Indian status, adapted economically. Mr. Thomas was known for her moccasins and jackets. His sons were more traditional things such as hunting, tracking, cattle handling, and rodeo performing.